Well, good day, everybody. It's Mike Missinelli here, my partner Vince Mola coming to us from New York City, and we're happy to touch base with you again with all our viewers and listeners of the Coldest Murder, the podcast that we started to kind of highlight the tragic murder of 9-year-old Caroline Doherty in the church law at the St. Mark's Church in Bristol Borough, PA. And we haven't been with you for a couple of weeks, so glad to see you guys again as we continue this story. There's so many other little twists to this story that we haven't gotten to yet. And this is a crime that obviously has shocked the Bristol community for those who lived there at the time of the murder and many years beyond, especially the Doherty family. Now, this is episode 11 of the podcast. In our previous episode, we told the sad tale of how this case directly affected the Doherty family through the eyes and the soul of Caroline Doherty's sister, Kay Doherty Talanka, who spoke with us via Zoom in episode 10. That interview was very emotional for Kay and for us, frankly. And I wanted to take this time to thank her so much for her courage in telling her story. We have spent so much time in this podcast on the lives of the suspects who may have committed this heinous act, but we never wanted to lose sight of the human element of this story, which was that a little girl's life was taken from her and her people had to live with a terrible void without her. And I think they expressed that in our last podcast. And just a quick update to the story. This podcast and its contents were fortunate enough to be noticed by CBS Saturday Morning, a national telecast, which brings to light the latest news stories and also some interesting life vignettes. And if you didn't get a chance to see it, you can call up the link on CBS Saturday Morning website. I believe it's cbssaturdaymorning.com. I want to personally thank the producer of the piece, Tony DiPolveri, who contacted me several weeks ago with his interest in this story. And he and CBS Saturday Morning anchor Dana Jacobson, I thought, did a wonderful job in presenting this story to a national audience. So we continue on, and people are asking, well, how many episodes are you going to do? We didn't really put a number on the episodes. If things are pertinent, we're going to continue with it. But the way I see it right now, we have at least a couple more episodes to get to, and then our last episode will be a wrap up of this whole tale. As you know, right now it's in the hands of the Bucks County DA's office. And we had the DA, Jen Shorn, on a podcast, on a previous podcast, and she announced on that podcast that they are committed and they have already have contracted with a lab, a DNA lab in Texas. And the cost of this is about $50,000, and they got a grant from that particular lab to go over this. So what we're talking about here is the DNA that was preserved from the original murder, even though it is been tainted and misstored and scant over all these years. They were hoping that this new sophisticated DNA test in its lab in Texas will be able to connect the dots through forensic genealogy by getting the DNA of the suspects and matching it up. It's a complicated situation way over my head, but not over the head of people like Colleen Fitzpatrick and a man we will talk about today as we continue the story. Okay, so um, where we are right now. And again, the goal of this podcast, Vince, and I think you'll agree, was to just shed so much light on this and create an awareness of
Yeah.
this cold case, which has been 62 years old, for the case to be solved by attention leading to scientific conclusion. And from that measure, I think we've done a pretty good job doing that because I think that this podcast really activated some further investigation and examination in this case. And we know that nothing can bring back Carol Ann, and we're not trying to exploit this case at all. In fact, we're trying to do the opposite, which is to bring attention to it, that it would not just disappear like it has for 62 years. And we always felt this case needed some kind of closure to the open wounds that have existed for all these years.
Well, with the opportunity for salaciousness in a story like this, and something that we've really avoided and took great care in avoiding, and I think that carried over into the CBS piece that was just done. The kinds of feedback that I saw online or heard directly from people that saw it said, God, it really mirrored how you guys have approached this. It was so thoughtful. And it really told the story in such a way that it brings this kind of awareness that you just alluded to. And I think that awareness shines a light that keeps people like Jen and the state troopers motivated and focused in, because it's the real world and they have a lot of other things to do that are contemporaneous. And so for us to continue to shed a light on this for the Doherty family and for the community of Bristol is important so that we can get to a resolution.
Yeah, and people know my personal involvement in this. I was touched by that murder, really specifically, as many people were who lived there. I mean, I was just a kid, and it was very impressionable what had happened. That a little girl my age had lost her life by a murderer, and so it stuck with me for a lot of years because a lot of people ask me, "Well, what was your motivation behind this whole thing?" It's just when you grow up in that kind of environment, you see what happened to the town after that and how parents who just were frightened to death of sending their kids just out in space, it sticks with you. And so all these years, it stuck with me. And I always vowed that, one day I would try to take a look at this. And I hope we've done it the right way. I hope people feel that we've done it the right way. So in this episode, let's clean up some loose ends. Now,
Yeah.
earlier in this series, that there were so many little spokes to this wheel with the suspects. And one of the possibilities that we threw out, which at the time was being considered, was a murder that had happened in Hazleton, PA. So there was a case in Hazleton, PA, and if you remember a previous podcast, we kind of tied in some really weird spokes to the whole thing, and it was a murder of a 9-year-old girl named Marise Chiverella in 1964. Now, this was 2 years after the 1962 murder of Carol Ann Doherty. And again, the weird connection was that the night before the murder of Marie Chiverella, about 200 people from Bristol had traveled to Hazleton to watch Bristol High School, which was my alma mater, playing a PIAA state tournament playoff game. And so we mused, and the authorities mused at the time, could the murder of Carol Ann been on that bus? And was this any way connected? Two 9-year-old girls were murdered with similar characteristics. Maurice was also raped and strangled with a piece of clothing stuffed in her mouth. The same MO, really, the Carol Ann Doherty case in the church at St. Mark's. So, in addition to this, one of the suspects being Joseph Sabatish, the priest in St. Mark's, um, we revealed some information that he was from Branchdale, Pennsylvania. That's only a 40-minute drive away from Hazleton. He had grown up there, and in fact, he had taken a couple of his child sexual victims to his mother's home in Branchdale, where he abused them. So, with these weird coincidences, they looked into the possibility that this was one and the same, that the murderer was the same, and so the Bristol connection going to Hazleton could have been somebody who committed the murder, was on that bus. So all these things were processed. Um, and with the Chiverella case, Maurice had gone missing. And so the town looked for her for a couple of days, and she was found dead several days later in an abandoned stripping pit that was used for trash dumping at the time. And they did investigate it. Intense investigation by the Pennsylvania State Police followed, but the case, as the Carol Ann case went cold for this many years. And unlike the Doherty case, there were really no suspects of any note. And the Carol Ann Doherty case, we described all the suspects that may have been cited in the area that may not have had alibis, and here there was nothing. So with that, let's reveal the truth of the matter. And the truth of the matter is the cases would have no connection. The Chiverella murder was finally solved in 2022 by DNA test, and it was determined by law authorities that the murderer was a local Hazleton man named Paul Forte. So if you count the years, it was a cold case for that many years, and DNA solved it at the end, which is what we're trying to do now. Now, Forte was a 22-year-old kind of slacker around Hazleton. He was kind of a local nobody. Um, he lived blocks, just a couple of blocks away from the Chiverella. So he was just a neighbor who decided to commit this murder, and he had long dead, and so the DNA revealed where they actually exhumed his body. We'll get into the specifics in a little bit. But the interesting part of this, it was solved with the help of a 20-year-old civilian from Medford, New Jersey, named Eric Schubert, who just happened to have a passing interest in genealogical investigations as kind of a hobby as he was going to college at Elizabethtown, which is kind of in that area. So, and his story, and we're going to talk to Eric in our next podcast because it's really interesting. Genealogy had been a major interest of his since he was 10 years old, if you can believe it. And his mother had suggested to him that since he was so interested in the subject, as a project or a hobby, perhaps he could dig into the ancestry of his own family through ancestry.com. So he did. And when school was shut down in Elizabethtown, during the COVID epidemic, Schubert found the time to dig into these cold cases, and hence he found the Chiverella case. So he had acquired some skills in matching up DNA, and that's what he did. And he contacted the Hazleton police, saying that he thought he could help the investigation of this, which is amazing to me. That the they went into their own police investigation. It was a cold case. I don't know how much more that they were investigating this whole thing. As we talked about before, Vince, cold cases kind of get pushed under the pile, and everybody forgets them for a while. But this guy insisted that he had a DNA connection. It's like and the way it's described is like a weather vane pointing in the general direction of the killer with a database hit. The genealogist creates a trail to the killer using clues from ancestry records, family trees, and newspaper clippings. And this is what he did. Now, the info is gauged. This is way above my head. Maybe you know better than me. The info is gauged in what's called centimorgans, and that's a measure of how genetically close you are to a relative. 100 centimorgans is weak. That's like a forgotten relative for the 18th century, but 2,000 centimorgans is a sibling. So he started out with a number 53, and within 2 years, he nailed it to have this DNA connection that he thought was this the Paul Forte. Pretty amazing stuff.
It's incredible. And Mike, one of the I just watched a documentary on Eric, well, about the case, and he's featured strong. He's a really interesting guy, really interesting young guy and character. And one of the things that kept ringing in my head as I was watching that and seeing the similarities at the time that case was solved in 2022, it was the fourth oldest cold case currently in America, which means our case is right up there in one of the top 3 or 2 cold cases that remains in America. And so they faced all the same types of obstacles, but there's one obstacle that our case has that one doesn't, and that's the Roman Catholic Church. And from the very beginning, the walls that they put up and the obstacles that they created and the influence that they had over the people, I think also has been one of the hindrances in ours that has a stark contrast between our case and that case.
Yeah. So just like Bristol, Hazleton, I assume is a little bigger than Bristol Borough. But it had kind of the same effect on the town. When something like this, a 9-year-old girl disappears and then you find her and she's murdered and raped and strangled, the town grieves for a really long time. So this obviously had an effect on Eric Schubert, like it had on me. I mean, he was just a college student in that area. The Pennsylvania State Police were in regular contact with the Chiverella. So we're talking now 58 years. And imagine the Chiverellas demanding answers. The Dohertys, they moved out. They left the area and they tried to put it behind them, but you can never put this behind you. But in Hazleton, the state police Chiverellas where it stayed in Hazleton, grieving for that many years, and the Pennsylvania State Police apparently had never given up. So in 2007, state investigators retrieved traces of body fluid from Marise's coat, and created a DNA profile. Okay, so once you got that, you have a baseline. And in 2019, a genetics lab in Boston called Parabon, um, well, they're actually, excuse me, Reston, Virginia, not Boston. They uploaded the material to a public DNA database, which is kind of the same thing they're going to do here, and got a hit. And the hit had matched a relative of Forte's, but it was too distant to be of help. So after reading about this case, our buddy Eric Schubert didn't see any updates on the story since 2019. He contacted Troop N in Luzerne County, which is the county up there, and offered his help. So, listen, you're a trooper, and this kid calls you out of the blue and says, "Listen, I think I can help you." And they're skeptical, but they go to visit him anyway at school, and they vet him, and he checks out. They liked him. They put him on the team. And so he began producing leads and generating names for the police to contact. And, the trooper is quoted in a story I was reading, a corporal, a state trooper, saying, whatever voodoo Shuby, by this time they're calling him Shuby, whatever he does is how we wound up getting those names. And what Schubert did was he just shook the family tree and filtered it down and came up with this name of a guy who was in the neighborhood of Marie Chiverella.
I'm looking forward to speaking to Eric about many things. One in particular is I want to nerd out with him a little bit about his method and how his detection works.
Mm-hmm.
I know that he uses a particular methodology that he created himself, and that he can go forward or backwards with this. And his pedigree was up until this point, like people who wanted to find an adoptive parent. And he was like, there's no difference. I'm trying to find something or someone. Yeah. And so I feel like what I'm really looking forward to after speaking with Colleen, who was really, brilliant and shed a lot of light on this and is a pioneer from the old days in this, and he's from the new school, is to find out, because I'm sure he knows about the methods that she's using in general, how he is doing this and how it's effective.
Yeah, and hopefully it's not too far over our head because we're not exactly the most brilliant people on earth to understand the methodology of this. But and the thing about the Caroline Doherty case is that we've gotten past where we're describing Eric Schubert was with the police trying to find a name. This Caroline Doherty case has names. It would be somebody asked me the other day, what happens if it finds if there's no DNA connection to the suspects that they're processing, that there's some mystery person? Well, I don't know how we would handle that. I don't know how the authorities would handle that. Would be a total flabbergasting development if that is the case. And I guess it's possible, which is why this DNA test and however long it takes, and Jen Shorn saying it could take a year. And even then, you might not get a connection, or you might get a connection that it's none of these. Would be shocking, and it would set the case back years if that's the case, because everybody is now deceased. I mean, what kind of leads could you develop at this point? But hopefully that doesn't happen. So just to continue this story, the troopers now are knocking on everybody's door. Everybody's a relative that has a connection to this Forte family, and they finally, or anybody who comes up in this DNA search. So they finally narrowed the case down to 4 suspects, with James Paul Forte being one of the 4 suspects. So they exhumed his body from a cemetery, a local cemetery. DNA was obtained, and on a February, so this was on January 6th, 2023, I guess. And February 3, the report comes back that Forte's DNA matched that was found on Maurice. Now that is the hit of all hits. that you get the connection right away. So it's okay. Well, how sure are you that he's the one? Well, here's the data. The possibility of another person having that DNA profile is 1 in 487 septillion. So you can be sure that that's a certain hit that Paul Forte was the murderer. 487 septillion is 487 followed by 24 zeros.
The by the way, in terms of this process, the exhuming of his body was ultimately granted by a judge because of the DNA work that Eric had done. And at
Yes.
the age of 18, which is or 20 or whatever he was, this young guy that you have that power and those skills is I think about that part of my own life, and I think of the things that I was doing and the things I was responsible for. Nothing, I can't even imagine the impact of that your report leads to exhuming a body.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. And again, like yeah, people try to explain this, if the zeros get in the way, they'll give you a hypothetical, and the hypothetical is it is estimated that 116 billion people have lived on Earth. So you would have to search 4 million other Earths with 116 billion people on each to find one person with the same DNA that was on Marise's clothing.
Wow, it's
So
incredible.
that's the ultimate DNA hit, which is what we're searching for now. Just in case you're interested in this murderer who is now long deceased, he lived in Hazleton his whole life. He graduated from Hazleton High School in 1959. The yearbook describes him as tall, blue-eyed, and handsome. Loves to sleep. Sports are his favorite, especially baseball. Future undecided. He enlisted in the Army. He was discharged in 1962, and he was arrested in 1974, charging him with rape, and he was sentenced to a year's probation. So again, we have a criminal element with this guy already. And this is why a lot of people, when they look at the Priest versus Schrader, and so somewhere along the line, Zucchero is still considered a suspect by authorities. But when you look at who has a criminal element in him, was it the priest? Obviously, he was a sexual predator to young children. Uh, the other guy, Schrader, was actually a criminal when he came to Bristol. So this is why it's been so perplexing to people, because just when you think that you have it figured out, you don't have it figured out, which is why the only thing we need to do is get it to a conclusion through what we're talking about here with the septillions in DNA.
And in the Hazelton case, part of the methodology was as they were going through the branches of the tree, they were looking for certain tags. And one of the tags that they were looking for in this community of people was a criminal record. And not just a criminal record, but a deviant sexual criminal record. And the ultimate person had all of these markers multiple times.
Yes, but what separate he also had a violent streak to him. So when we look at the priest Sabatish, and you go, okay, where was the violent streak in him? There was no evidence that he had some kind of violent streak where he would actually like, he sexually molested children, boys and girls. Did he have anything in his background that would indicate that kind of violent behavior? We could actually strangle somebody. The other guy didn't have really elements of any sexual deviation, but had more of a criminal element. So it makes your head hurt when you think, because just when you want to come up to the conclusion yourself, you have to weigh all these little factors, which is why we're striving so hard to get to the end of this. And so what's going to happen with this particular podcast? I am still trying to get the investigator currently in charge of it. I think he would be able to really enlighten us about what happens and how you investigate a cold case after so many years. And this trooper has been with the Caroline Dougherty case since 2017. So I really think he can enlighten us. I'm hoping to get that. And then we're just going to do a kind of a wrap up of this whole thing and maybe come to our own conclusions on who we actually think did it. And we will give you those opinions. I'm used to picking football games, which is like way beneath this, but I'm going to give you my opinion based on all the data that we've gone through to that who did that. I think I know now, but I'm going to wait until the very last minute to determine who I think it is, and I think you'll do the same thing.
It's true, and because every day I feel like the wind takes me in different directions. I learn something new about whether it's DNA or our suspects, and then I also, and I don't know how much this impacts you, Mike, but I talk to people that are following this podcast, and I also read the comments, and I read I read the comments on YouTube for the CBS because it's available there, the story that they did. And people have definite opinions. And I think maybe because of all the scandals that happened with the Catholic Church, that people are hell-bent on seeing the priest, which I understand. And one of the things that I keep thinking about since our discussion with the judge, former police chief,
Frank
as well.
Parenteau, yeah, Frank Parenteau,
Yep.
former Bristol police chief.
And Jen, the DA, who kind of, resolutely pushed the priest aside. And somebody I spoke to recently who's following along said, one of the things that's interesting about the priest as a suspect is that he had home court advantage in that church. He knew the comings and goings of people, of other priests. He knew the timing of things. He had a different sense, and he also knew where to be, where to hide, where to go if he were to commit something. Jen had said something to us about she didn't think he was somebody who would commit a crime of impulse.
Yes.
Right? But that home court advantage thing, again, has been ringing in my head. But like you might, in 2 weeks from now or 2 podcasts from now, I might feel just completely different about all of this.
Yeah, it is a really perplexing situation to come to a conclusion on because you can create scenarios in your mind. Yes, okay, yeah, the priest had a home field advantage, but the other guy lived on the street. The other guy lied about where he was, and I'm thinking to myself, why would that guy lie that he was at work when he wasn't? And then come up with another story and take the fifth and all those things. And it just adds up for me that you know, I, I want to really, when you think about it, yes, I feel the same passion against the Catholic Church and all that went on. And so I feel, well, if somebody needs to get their comeuppance, it would be the Catholic Church. But I really don't know. And so again, we're gonna do a couple more of these podcasts, and then we have to give it up to science. And then it is up to science to pronounce whatever they're going to pronounce and find. And then we will come back and resume at least one podcast to discuss the whole thing. So now that might put us on hiatus, but just keep in mind that we're not going to drop this. It's just not going to drop. We're going to be following this every day. And I will be making calls every day, frankly, to find out when we can get any kind of a time stamp on this whole thing. So on that note, thank you, guys. It's a little shorter podcast than we usually do, but I wanted to, since we had brought it up earlier, that there was another plank to this whole story, this Hazelton thing. I know that people had emailed me saying that, that case was solved, and we knew it was solved, and we were going to come back to explaining how it was solved eventually. But in doing these things, it is a whodunit, and we wanted to consider all the levels that were involved here.
Well, and Mike, I hope people I'd like to shed light to the people who do follow this so that they know how dogged you have been in this. And I see your journalistic roots all the time. And I know that that has helped to get us to here. And I hope that it continues to get us to a place of resolution.
Yeah, and again, it's not about. I didn't do this for any kind of glory. I
No.
did it, because it is basically how I was trained as a journalist to find the truth about certain things. And my career took a different path, but this is how I started. And it's really interesting to me that if you dig hard enough, you can find out some things, and the power of the press and doing things like this can really activate things like a further investigation. And at the very least, I hope that we've done that with this, that we got people to really pay a lot more attention to it and keep those wheels turning, but turning even faster than they were. So, on that note, Vince, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for listening to podcast number 11. And we will be back with our next podcast. Will feature Eric Schubert, the man who doggedly pursued the DNA angle of the Chiverella case in Hazleton. That should be very interesting. So, until then, thanks everybody for listening and watching. And we'll talk to you later. Thank you. Bye bye.